The document was 17 pages long, and Executor Veilsorin had read it 4 times before she noticed what was missing. Not missing in the obvious sense. The Conclave's declaration of unified pressure was thorough, meticulous, even, 43 signatory species, economic embargo clauses, transit restrictions through 7 major hyperlanes, military positioning protocols along the outer boundary of what everyone had quietly started calling the quarantine belt. Everything was there, numbered and stamped and cross-referenced with the appropriate jurisdictional authorities. What was missing was a word. One specific word that should have appeared on page 9, in Clause 14 Delta, beneath the military positioning language. A word that every previous conclave declaration of this type had used. A word so standard that its absence from the document had apparently gone unnoticed by 43 species, their legal teams, their ambassadors, and the 200-year institutional memory of the interstellar conclave itself. The word was *withdrawal. There was no withdrawal clause. Veilsorin set the document down on her desk and looked out at the stars. She had been executor of the Sorin Compact for 11 years, which meant she had spent 11 years being the person in the room who read the things other people assumed they had already read. It was not a glamorous role. It was, however, an accurate one. The Compact was not a military power. It was not an economic giant. Tucked between 2 larger empires in the middle arc of the galactic disk, the Sorin Compact was precisely the kind of civilization that survived by being careful with alliances, careful with language, careful with the particular silence that falls in a room just before everyone agrees to something no one has fully thought through. She had been in that room 3 weeks ago, when the conclave convened the emergency session on the human question. She remembered how it felt, the urgency, the near unanimity, the quiet, collective relief of 43 species finally moving in one direction after years of fragmented, contradictory policy on Earth. And she remembered the exact moment Ambassador Threx of the Karath Dominion had stood and said, with great confidence, that humanity had demonstrated it was not ready for full galactic membership, and that the appropriate response was unified, coordinated pressure until humans agreed to accept monitoring protocols and behavioral modification agreements. She remembered nodding. She was now deeply unsure why she had nodded. "Archivist," she said, not looking away from the stars. The small blue-white figure materialized at the edge of her desk, her personal AI, rendered as a hovering approximation of humanoid form, which she had always found vaguely comforting. Executor. Pull every previous conclave declaration of economic and military pressure issued in the last 200 years, cross-reference for Clause 14 Delta language, specifically withdrawal provisions. A pause, shorter than it should have been, which meant the archivist had already been running this analysis. All previous declarations contain explicit withdrawal language, duration caps, review cycles, and exit conditions for all signatory parties. The declaration against Earth contains none of these. How did that pass legal review? It did not fail legal review, the archivist said. It was never submitted to legal review. The session moved to ratification within 48 standard hours of the draft being circulated. This is approximately 19 times faster than the conclave's own procedural guidelines recommend for declarations of this type. 19 times faster. 3 weeks ago, she had thought that was decisive leadership, the kind of clear, collective action the conclave had famously struggled to produce. She was now looking at it differently. Who drafted the declaration? Another pause that wasn't really a pause. The original framework was submitted by the office of Ambassador Threx. However, records indicate he submitted it in response to a request from the Karath Strategic Council, which had received a threat assessment report 6 weeks prior. The threat assessment was authored by a consulting group called the Boundary Institute. I've never heard of the Boundary Institute. They have no prior record with the conclave. They appear to have been formed approximately 4 months before the report was submitted. Veil Soren finally looked away from the stars. 4 months. A consulting group formed 4 months before producing the defining threat assessment that convinced 43 civilizations to coordinate against a single planet, without a withdrawal clause, in 19 times the normal time frame. The first question that surfaced was obvious: who benefits? The second question arrived immediately behind it, quieter and much more unsettling. What do they know about humans that they aren't saying? The third question came last, barely a whisper. What do humans know about this that we don't? Her aide, a young Sauron named Calith, knocked and entered without waiting, which meant it was genuinely urgent. The human ambassador is requesting an audience, Calith said. She's been at the outer gate of the Compact's administrative district since before dawn. Station logs say she arrived approximately 4 hours ago and simply waited. 4 hours, Veil Soren said, in the corridor. Yes, she brought what appears to be a container of hot liquid and a physical book. She hasn't spoken to security staff beyond identifying herself. She's just waiting. Veil Soren had read the Conclave's behavioral briefings on humans. Waiting was not supposed to be something humans did well. The briefings described them as impulsive, emotionally volatile, prone to confrontational escalation when faced with obstacles. The Karath threat assessment had used phrases like *unpredictable aggression threshold and *limited capacity for strategic patience. A woman who had been sitting quietly in a corridor for 4 hours with a book did not match any of those phrases. Send her up, Veil Soren said. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was shorter than Veil Soren had expected, which was a meaningless observation but a persistent one. She wore a dark, practical coat. She carried a ceramic mug that was now clearly empty and had been for some time, given that she held it with the loose grip of someone who had long since stopped expecting anything from it. The book, an actual physical printed book, which was startling, was tucked under her arm. She sat down across from Veil Soren without being asked, set the mug on the edge of the desk with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly where it would and wouldn't cause offense, and said, "You read the clause." "Not a question." "I noticed an absence," Veil Soren said. Most people notice absences only after they start feeling their consequences. Vasquez set the book on her knee. "You noticed before, that's why I'm here. You've been watching for someone to notice." "We've been watching for 41 days. She said it the way someone states a fact they have repeated to themselves many times, steadily, without drama. Of 43 signatories, you are the first to make an inquiry that touched on the drafting process. 41 days, 43 species, and only one had looked at the document closely enough to notice what wasn't there. What, Veil Soren said carefully, is Earth's actual situation?" Vasquez looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not calculation, something older than calculation. Something that looked, to Veil Soren's limited experience reading human faces, like a person deciding how much of a weight to set down. "The embargo is working," Vasquez said. "Supply lines for 3 of our outer colonies are already strained. Medical equipment, agricultural systems. We're 14 months from genuine humanitarian crisis in those areas if nothing changes." She paused. "That's the answer to the question you asked. I want to answer the question you didn't ask." "Go ahead." "The declaration isn't about Earth's behavior. Earth's behavior hasn't changed significantly in the 20 years since we joined the outer membership rolls. We've complied with every treaty, paid every membership contribution, filed every required report." She held Veil Soren's gaze. "The declaration is about preventing our behavior from changing, specifically one behavior." Veil Soren waited. "We've been independently developing a drive system," Vasquez said, "not within any conclave framework, not under any joint research agreement, alone. And it works. The room was very quiet. What kind of drive system? Vasquez shook her head, not refusing, but organizing. The kind that makes hyperlane access optional for everyone. The implications arrived in sequence, each one displacing the previous like water filling a vessel. Hyperlanes were not merely faster-than-light travel corridors. They were, in the most precise economic and political sense, the architecture of galactic power. Who controlled hyperlane access controlled trade, military projection, diplomatic reach. The Karath Dominion held transit authority over 3 of the 7 lanes now restricted to Earth. The founding members of the Conclave had built their institutional primacy, over 200 years, on the simple geographic fact that hyperlane access was finite and unequally distributed. A drive system that made hyperlane access optional would not merely change Earth's situation. It would change everything. How long have you had it? Vale Soren said. A working prototype for 8 months, before the Boundary Institute was formed. Before, the word landed like a stone. Does the Conclave know the drive exists? The Karath Strategic Council does. We believe they shared the assessment with 4 other founding members. The declaration was ratified 3 months later. She picked up the empty mug, looked at it, set it back down. 41 days ago. You couldn't simply present the technology through proper channels. Request renegotiation of. We tried. It was the first time Vasquez's voice had changed, not louder but compressed, the way a material changes when pressure is applied. 8 months ago, our delegation filed a formal technology disclosure request with the Conclave's Science and Development Council. We never received confirmation of receipt. Never received, not denied, not reviewed, never received. Archivist, Vale Soren said. I'm already searching, the archivist said from the corner. Vale Soren looked at Vasquez. You knew there was a good chance that filing disappeared. We suspected. We needed to confirm. And we needed someone on the inside of the Conclave to confirm it with us, because an accusation from Earth right now, she stopped, shook her head. An accusation from Earth is exactly what they'd expect. It proves nothing. It looks like exactly the kind of unilateral confrontational behavior the declaration claims were prone to. So instead, they had waited. 41 days. Waiting for someone to read a document carefully, notice an absence, and make an inquiry, at which point the paper trail would begin to assemble itself through official compact channels rather than through an Earth diplomatic complaint. It was, Vale Soren thought, an extraordinarily patient strategy. Quiet, precise, designed to let the truth surface through someone else's curiosity rather than their own urgency. The Karath assessment had described humanity as having limited capacity for strategic patience. Filing confirmed absent from all Conclave records, the archivist said. However, I am detecting a secondary anomaly. There is a record of the document being * received, timestamped within the Science and Development Council's internal system, followed 4 hours later by a record of deletion. The deletion was authorized under a Council Administrator Access Code. Vasquez closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked like someone who had just confirmed something they had hoped very much would not be confirmed. Who holds that code, she said, though it wasn't really a question. The code is registered to the office of the Council's Senior Administrative Director, the archivist said, who is, under the Conclave's organizational charter, appointed by the founding members' rotational committee, current chair of that committee. Ambassador Threx, Vale Soren said. Silence. Executor, Vasquez said. She wasn't looking at the stars. She was looking directly at Vale Soren with an expression that was very carefully not asking anything. That was, instead, simply present in the way of someone who has carried something a very long way and arrived at the place where they must decide whether to set it down. I did not come here to ask you to join us, or to advocate for us, or to take a political risk on Earth's behalf. I came here because you read the clause. because that means there's still a chance that what's happening here gets seen clearly by someone withstanding to do something about it. And if I do nothing, then in 14 months, 3 colonies are in crisis. In 18 months, Earth invokes emergency humanitarian protocols and begins using the drive system to bypass the embargo. At that point, the Kareth have exactly the confrontation they've been engineering. They call it unprovoked unilateral defiance. The declaration expands. 43 becomes 50, 60. We become, permanently, the species that proved we couldn't be trusted. She stood, picked up the empty mug, picked up the book. The filing record is in your archivist system now. That's compact data under compact jurisdiction. What you do with it is entirely your decision. She paused at the door. Thank you for reading the clause. Then she left. Vale Soren sat for a long time. The archivist's soft light pulsed once. Executor, I should flag one additional element of the filing anomaly. Tell me. The deletion record contains a secondary embedded timestamp, one that does not appear to have been intentional. It is consistent with an automatic system backup that captured the document in transit before deletion. The backup exists in the Conclave's deep archive, under non-indexed storage, which means the document technically still exists within Conclave jurisdiction. Yes, and under Conclave archival law, any member state with signatory standing may request retrieval of non-indexed archive content for legal review purposes. The Soren Compact had signatory standing, had held it for 160 years, had never once used it for anything that might be described as confrontational. Vale Soren thought about the word that wasn't on page 9. She thought about 41 days and an empty mug, and a woman reading a physical book in a corridor before dawn. She thought about a consulting group that was 4 months old when it wrote a document that changed the fate of a species. Caliph, she said. Her aide appeared in the doorway. Executor. I need to speak with our legal office, and I need you to find out exactly when the next conclave session is scheduled. She paused. Also, find out if Ambassador Vasquez has eaten anything today. She's been sitting in a corridor since before dawn. Caliph blinked. Yes, Executor. One more thing. She looked at the document still on her desk. Page 9. Clause 14 Delta. The space where a word should have been. Get me a complete list of every conclave member state that is not a founding member. Every species that joined under the outer membership roles in the last 50 years, the way Earth did. I want to know how many of them have had technology disclosure filings go missing. The pause that followed was the longest one yet. I will begin that search immediately, the archivist said. Executor, preliminary modeling suggests the number may not be small. It was not small. The number was 19. 19 non-founding member species, across 51 years, had submitted technology disclosure requests to the Conclave's Science and Development Council. 14 of those filings had no record of receipt. Of the 5 that were received, 3 had been formally declined without explanation. 1 had been absorbed into a joint research framework under founding member oversight, which meant the originating species retained no independent development rights, and 1 had been approved, contingent on the applicant species signing a modified membership agreement that quietly replaced their standard sovereign research protections, with a clause that gave the founding members council veto authority over all future independent technological development. That species had signed. Vale Soren pulled their current economic data. They were thriving, well-integrated, frequently cited in conclave promotional materials as a model of successful galactic membership. They had not developed a single, independently significant technology in the 30 years since signing. The Soren Compact, Vale Soren said slowly, our original membership agreement. Standard outer track membership, the archivist confirmed. You joined under the framework that was standard before the modified agreement was introduced. Your sovereign research protections are intact. By accident of timing, by approximately 6 years, the modified agreement was introduced 7 years after the compact joined. 6 years. If the compact had joined 6 years later, Vale Soren would now be living in a civilization that had quietly, legally, formally surrendered the right to think for itself. She had been executor for 11 years and had spent much of that time proud of the compact's careful, undramatic path through galactic politics. She had thought their restraint was wisdom. She was now looking at it and wondering if it had simply been a kind of slow, comfortable diminishment they'd been too careful to notice. "Caliph," she said. He appeared. He had the look of someone who had been standing just outside the door for some time. "The legal office is ready," and he hesitated. "I found Ambassador Vasquez. She's in the public transit hub 2 levels down. She appears to be waiting for a return shuttle. She thinks I'm going to do nothing." Caliph said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "Tell the legal office to prepare an archival retrieval request under Article 7 of the Conclave's founding charter. Full formal filing, not a preliminary inquiry. A formal request, on compact letterhead, to be transmitted to Conclave Central Records within the hour." And Ambassador Vasquez. Vale Soren was already pulling up her communication terminal. "I'll handle that myself." She didn't call, she went down. It took 7 minutes to reach the transit hub, which meant she was walking at a pace that Caliph had to extend himself slightly to match, which was unusual. Vale Soren was not, as a rule, a person who rushed. Vasquez was exactly where Caliph had said, seated on a transit bench with the book open, but her eyes not moving across the page, in the way of someone reading the same line repeatedly without processing it. Vale Soren sat down next to her. Vasquez looked up, and whatever she had been prepared to see, it wasn't this. For just a moment, her face did the thing that Vale Soren was beginning to understand was probably fairly rare. It showed what was actually happening underneath it. Something that looked like relief so intense it was nearly indistinguishable from grief. "There are 19 other species," Vale Soren said. Vasquez closed the book. "We know." "You asterisk no. Earth has been trying to contact them for 6 months, carefully, through back channels." She paused. "Most of them are too afraid to respond. 3 did." She looked down at the cover of the book, some kind of historical account, Vale Soren noticed, though she couldn't read the title from this angle. "We've been trying to figure out how to prove a pattern that everyone who benefits from the pattern has strong incentive to deny. The archival record I'm filing in," Vale Soren checked the time. 43 minutes will establish an official legal inquiry within compact jurisdiction. The conclave cannot interfere with a member state's internal legal proceedings, which means the record's existence becomes a matter of compact sovereign legal record whether or not the conclave chooses to acknowledge it. Vasquez was very still. "That exposes you." "Yes. The Karath won't ignore this. If the filing leads where we think it leads, the compact will be. The compact has been careful for 160 years, Vale Soren said, and I am looking at a document that proves careful civilizations survive by becoming smaller versions of themselves, until one day there's nothing left that they actually chose." She paused. "I have a daughter. She's 8. I would very much like her to grow up in a galaxy where the truth of what happened here is part of the record." Vasquez looked at her for a long moment. "We have the drive system," she said quietly. "Working prototype. We have 3 others in various stages of testing. When this," she stopped, "started again. If this becomes a legal and political crisis for the conclave, Earth will offer the technology freely. No licensing, no joint framework, open access, every member species, founding and non-founding alike. We've already committed to that. You're giving away the most valuable technology in the galaxy. We're making it so that the Karath have no reason to want to suppress it." Her voice had gone very flat. You can't strangle access to something that's freely available. The moment the embargo becomes obviously counterproductive even on its own terms, it stops having political support. The declaration collapses. And Earth becomes the species that handed hyperlane-free travel to everyone, including the civilizations that just spent 41 days blockading your outer colonies. Yes, that will cost you, diplomatically, strategically. We know. And there was something in those two words, the same compression as before, the same sense of enormous weight held in a very small container. We've run the models. We lose significant short-term leverage. We absorb costs we could have avoided. Some of the founding members will never fully forgive us for making the filing public, even if we're right. Then why? Because the alternative is winning in a way that makes us exactly what the Kareth said we were. She looked up, not at Vale Soren, at the transit hub's high transparent ceiling and the faint star-scattered dark beyond it. We could use the drive to break the embargo unilaterally. We could make the filing public through Earth channels instead of compact ones, more dramatic, more immediate leverage. We could play this for maximum advantage. A pause. We chose not to. Because in 50 years, when my grandchildren are trying to be part of this galaxy, I want the record to show what we actually did, not what we could have done. The transit shuttle chimed its imminent departure. Vasquez didn't move. I'm not going back on that shuttle, she said. It was almost a question. No, Vale Soren said, you're not. The archival retrieval request went out at the 50-minute mark, rather than the 43 Vale Soren had estimated, because the legal office had insisted on a second review, not from reluctance, but because they had found, in the process of drafting, 3 additional procedural violations in the declaration's ratification that Vale Soren hadn't even known to look for. The request was formally logged by Conclave Central Records at the end of the standard business cycle. Under Conclave protocol, a logged archival retrieval request from a member state with signatory standing triggered an automatic notification to the Council of Founders. Ambassador Threx received that notification approximately 6 hours after Vasquez had sat down in a corridor with an empty mug and a book. He transmitted an inquiry to the Soren Compact's administrative office within 20 minutes. Vale Soren did not respond. This was not a snub. She was, under Article 7, technically in a legally restricted communication period during the retrieval process, and she had made sure the legal office sent the appropriate notification explaining this. Everything was correct. Everything was documented. She spent that evening reading the book Vasquez had left behind. The ambassador had pressed it into her hands in the transit hub with a look that said it was relevant without saying how. It was a human history book. Specifically, a history of human legal and political movements. It was not exciting. It was meticulous, detailed, and full of stories of people who had spent decades on slow, careful work that was not dramatic and was not celebrated and was not, for most of its duration, apparently winning. She read it most of the night. At one point, Calith knocked, came in, set a cup of something warm on the desk, and left without speaking. She appreciated this more than she would have been able to explain. The conclave session was in 11 days. In those 11 days, 4 things happened that were not supposed to happen. First, the archival retrieval surfaced the deleted filing as expected. The document was certified intact and entered into compact legal record. This took 3 days. Second, the 3 non-founding species that had previously responded to Earth's back-channel contacts, upon learning through their own networks that the Soren Compact had formally initiated the retrieval process, transmitted formal statements of support for the inquiry to compact diplomatic channels. They did not, could not, given political pressure, do so publicly. But the statements existed. They were dated. They were real. Third, a Kareth diplomatic vessel entered Soren space and requested a meeting with Vale Soren under informal protocols. Meaning off the record, No official documentation, the kind of meeting that was designed to be deniable. She declined formally, citing the Article 7 communication restrictions, and logged the meeting request in the compact's own diplomatic records. Now there was a record of the Karath attempting to contact the compact during an active legal proceeding. That record was also real. Fourth, and this was the thing Veilsorin had not anticipated, 2 additional founding member species, quietly, separately, requested access to the compact's legal filing as interested observers. Not allies, not opponents, observers. Under conclave procedural rules, interested observer status during a member state legal proceeding was a standard mechanism that had existed for 2 centuries and had almost never been used because there had almost never been anything interesting enough to observe. They were watching. 2 of the oldest, most powerful civilizations in the galaxy were watching, which meant they were not certain their own interests were fully aligned with the Karaths, which meant the consensus was not as absolute as the 43 signatures suggested. The declaration has a fracture, Calith said, standing in her office doorway on the morning of the 9th day. He sounded like someone who had just understood something large. It always had a fracture. It was built quickly, Veilsorin said. Things built quickly usually do. Is that why Earth waited? Because they knew it would. Ask Ambassador Vasquez, she said. I suspect she'll tell you they hoped. There's a difference. On the morning of the session, Veilsorin prepared 2 documents. The first was the formal presentation of the compact's archival retrieval findings, with the procedural violations appended and the pattern analysis of 19 missing filings included. It was 47 pages long, meticulously sourced, and completely devastating if read in full by anyone with the authority to act on it. The second document was shorter, 3 paragraphs, a formal statement of the Saurin Compact's position on the Declaration of Unified Pressure. She read it once more before she transmitted it. The Saurin Compact has reviewed the Declaration of Unified Pressure against Earth in light of newly retrieved archival documentation, and has determined that the declaration was ratified under conditions that do not meet the Conclave's own procedural standards. Specifically, the declaration lacks withdrawal provisions required by precedent. The threat assessment upon which it was based was produced by an organization with a demonstrable conflict of interest, and primary supporting documentation was suppressed within Conclave systems prior to review. The Saurin Compact is not in a position to confirm that the declaration reflects the genuine collective determination of its signatories, rather than the managed outcome of a coordinated process designed to produce a predetermined result. Accordingly, the Saurin Compact formally suspends its participation in the declaration pending full independent review, and calls upon the Conclave to establish a review mechanism consistent with its founding charter's requirements for transparency and procedural integrity. We further note that the Saurin Compact is not acting in this matter on behalf of Earth, nor as an advocate for any particular outcome. We are acting because the integrity of conclave process is not an abstraction. It is the specific, concrete reason that 160 years ago, the Compact chose to join. She added one final line, which was not in any previous draft, which she wrote in the 10 minutes before transmission, and which Calith read over her shoulder, and then looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. We note for the permanent record that the species which alerted us to the procedural concern did so not by demanding action, but by waiting 41 days in the hope that someone would notice independently. We found this unusual. Upon reflection, we find it admirable. It is, in its way, the most precise argument for the character of that species that we have encountered. She transmitted both documents simultaneously to the conclave session, to all 43 signatories, to the 3 supporting species, to the 2 observer founders, and to the public diplomatic record. Then she sat back and thought about a woman in a corridor with a book and an empty mug. The session was not brief. She sat through 7 hours of procedural argument, Karath objections, counterfilings, and the particular kind of institutional fury that organizations generate when someone has used their own rules against them precisely and correctly. Ambassador Threx's representative spoke for 40 minutes and said in various formulations that the compact was acting unilaterally, was being manipulated by Earth, was endangering galactic stability, and was setting a dangerous precedent. Each time, Vale Soren's legal representative responded with a citation and a timestamp. The 2 observer founders requested a procedural recess after hour 4. During the recess, Vale Soren received a message from an address she didn't immediately recognize. It was one of the other founding members, not one of the observers. The message contained 3 words: "We are listening." She filed that message into the permanent record too. The review mechanism passed by an 11-vote margin with 9 abstentions in the 8th hour. It was not a victory for Earth. It was, technically, only a procedural determination that an independent review would occur. The declaration was not nullified. The embargo was not lifted. But the withdrawal clause question was now formally under review. The Boundary Institute was now subject to a conflict of interest investigation under conclave charter rules. The 19 missing filings were now part of the official record. The deletion timestamp was now evidence in a proceeding that could not be quietly made to disappear, because it was already documented in 3 separate member state legal systems. The fracture was not closed. It was instead mapped. Vasquez found her afterward in a side corridor of the conclave's administrative center, which was where Vale Soren had gone to be very briefly alone. The human ambassador had the look of someone who had been watching events from a great distance and was still processing the distance between hopping and having. "The review will take time," Vale Soren said before Vasquez could speak. "Months, probably. The declaration stays in place during review. Your colonies are still in difficulty." "I know." She leaned against the corridor wall. She looked, for the first time since Vale Soren had met her, genuinely tired, not defeated, but the kind of tired that is allowed to exist once something enormous has been set down. "We have contingency supply routes. It'll be hard but manageable." The drive system announcement goes out tomorrow, publicly, free access, no restrictions. She said it simply. "We committed to that timeline when we decided to file through you rather than going public ourselves. We're keeping it." Vale Soren looked at her. "Some of your own people must have argued for more favorable timing. Use the announcement as leverage during the review, more strategic." Some did. A small, exhausted thing that might have been a smile. "We argued about it for 6 weeks. It was not a comfortable 6 weeks. And we decided that if we're asking the conclave to uphold its own principles, we should probably uphold ours first." There was a long silence. "The last line of my filing," Vale Soren said. "I want to know if you would have done the same thing, waited, if you'd been in my position and Earth had been in the compacts." Vasquez thought about it. Genuinely, she didn't answer immediately, and she didn't produce a polished response. She thought about it the way a person thinks about something they are not entirely certain of. "I'd like to say yes," she said finally. "I know what we planned for, what we hoped for, but 41 days is a long time to hope." She paused. "I started reading that book on day 12. I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't just counting days." Vale Soren thought about her daughter, who was 8, and who would grow up knowing that the galaxy had been asked a question about what it was and had, eventually, slowly, imperfectly, with a great deal of procedural argument, started to answer it correctly. "What's the book about?" she asked. Vasquez looked briefly surprised. Then, people who change things by being annoyingly specific about the rules. She glanced down at the corridor floor. "It's a very long book." "I know. I read most of it." Vale Soren started walking back toward the session hall because there were still 4 more procedural matters to address and a legal representative who needed guidance. You can have it back when I'm finished. The review took 4 months, not several. The Boundary Institute's founders were, it turned out, registered as financial beneficiaries of 6 Kareth corporate entities. This was not a subtle finding. It was the kind of finding that, once surfaced, generated its own momentum. 3 additional founding members moved from observer status to active review participants. And the Kareth's political position contracted faster than their strategic council had modeled as possible. The declaration was formally suspended 9 months after Vasquez had waited in a corridor with a book. Earth's drive system, released freely the morning after the conclave session, had by that point already been adapted by 7 species. 3 others were in testing. Hyperlane authority was not immediately irrelevant, infrastructure takes time, but the trajectory was visible to anyone who cared to look, which meant that what the Kareth had tried to prevent was now inevitable, and the only question was the shape of the world that followed. The Compact's relationship with 3 founding members was complicated. In the specific diplomatic sense of asterisk complicated, that means it required careful management and would for a generation. There were costs. There were still are. In the final session of the review process, before the suspension was formally announced, Ambassador Threx, who had not resigned, because powerful people rarely resign, made a brief statement acknowledging procedural irregularities in the declaration's ratification process and expressing confidence in the conclave's ability to learn from those irregularities. He did not apologize. That would have been too much to expect. Vale Soren submitted a formal response on behalf of the Compact. It was 2 sentences. The Soren Compact accepts the findings of the review and looks forward to the continued strengthening of conclave procedural norms. We note that procedural norms are only as strong as the willingness of member states to enforce them when doing so is inconvenient. In the hallway afterward, Vasquez said, "That last sentence. Too much." "No," the exhausted almost smile again, "just enough." Vale Soren's daughter, whose name was Sale, asked her once, years later, in the flat, unceremonious way of children asking things they don't fully understand the weight of, why the humans were different from other species. Vale Soren thought about it. She thought about 19 missing filings in 41 days and a word that wasn't on page 9. She thought about a woman who had known for 8 months that she held the most disruptive technology in the galaxy and had chosen, carefully and at significant cost, not to use it as a weapon. She thought about a consulting group formed 4 months before it produced a report that almost ended a civilization's future, and the civilization that had almost ended sitting in a corridor with a book because it believed, had to believe, that someone would eventually read carefully enough. "They don't stop," she said finally. "Most species, when the situation is clearly decided against them, adapt, find a different path, accept the shape of the thing." She paused. "Humans adapt too, but they hold on to something the whole time, some idea of what things should be, even when things are demonstrably not that. And they wait, even when waiting is very long and very uncomfortable. And they don't let go of the small specific details that everyone else finds too tedious to care about." Sale considered this. "Is that good?" Vale Soren looked out at the stars. In the 41 days that Vasquez had been sitting in corridors and transit hubs across 3 different conclave member state capitals, reading the same book and drinking hot liquid until it went cold, the Kareth Strategic Council had been running projections on when humanity would break, when the pressure would become too much, when Earth would make the irrational, aggressive, emotionally reactive decision that the threat assessment said was inevitable. They had been watching very carefully. They had been watching for completely the wrong thing. "It's not comfortable," Vale Soren said, "for anyone including themselves." She was quiet for a moment, "But yes, I think it is." She did not add what she was also thinking, which was this. Somewhere in the Conclave's history, long before Earth ever arrived in the galactic community, every species now sitting behind the founding members' table had faced a moment where they too could have waited, where they too could have held the small specific detail, and the long uncomfortable hope, and the decision not to turn what they had into a weapon, even when the weapon was right there. Most of them had made the other choice. It had made them powerful. It had made them the architects of the thing they now defended. And a species that had been part of this galaxy for 20 years, that had arrived with curiosity and a technology they built alone, and a habit of filing proper paperwork, had looked at the shape of what had been built and done the one thing powerful civilizations consistently failed to do. They had read the document all the way to page 9. They had noticed the word that wasn't there. And they had waited, patiently and precisely, and at genuine cost, for someone else to notice too, because they understood that a truth discovered is different from a truth delivered, and that a galaxy worth living in could only be built by the first kind. The stars didn't answer. They never did. But there were more paths between them now than there had been a year ago, and the paths belonged to everyone, and somewhere out in the wide dark, a species that had been described as impulsive and dangerous and incapable of strategic patience, was going about the extraordinary, unglamorous work of being exactly what it had always been. Specific, stubborn, willing to wait. Willing, long after every rational civilization would have moved on, to sit in a corridor with a book and an empty cup, believing, requiring, that someone would eventually read carefully enough to see what was missing. Not because the galaxy had earned that faith. Because they had decided